In my last video, we were looking at if the 4070 Ti Super was worth $200 more than a 4070 Super, and price to performance wise, right now today, it isn't from a value proposition, except for the fact that that jumps you up to 16 gigabytes of VRAM over the 12 gigabytes of VRAM. But the 4070 Super was certainly holding a better price to performance metric. But again, that VRAM situation. But if you do decide to spend the additional money to get the 16 gigabytes of VRAM, maybe you'll hang on to your GPUs for 2 or 3 generations, you're like 12's not gonna cut it for that long, well, then you now would want to be considering, okay, I'm spending $800 on the 4070 Ti Super, should I spend another $200 extra on the 4080 Super? Does that make any sense? And that's the comparison we're focusing on in today's video, the 16 gigabyte 4080 Super against the 16 gigabyte 4070 Ti Super. Notice this time they're both 16 gigabyte products, so you're not getting additional VRAM if you spend the extra $200. And is it even $200 extra? Well, on MSRPs, it should be. The 4080 Super should be $999.99, and I haven't seen one in stock in that price for a long time, although one just popped up available a few minutes before I filmed this video. I have a feeling if I film this a few hours later, this one will probably be gone again, because the MSRP models have been few and far between. And most of them have been sitting in stock closer to the $1,200 price point that 4080s were sitting at all along. And remember, the 4080 and the 4080 Super perform the same. It's within a 1 to 3% variance, so they're basically the same product. So buy whichever one's cheaper. But anyway, so in other words, if we're looking at the value calculation with this, we could look at it as MSRPs, but also where they actually cost on the current market. So currently, you're looking at spending 25% more money if you want to buy the 4080 Super over the 4070 Ti Super. Sorry, that would be $200 more, which is a 25% price increase. Now, the problem also is that, like I said, most of the models are closer to $1,200, which would be a 50% price increase. And to be clear, the 4070 Ti Supers are very much widely available at their $800 reference MSRP. Several models in stock right now, and a few more that are just a little bit higher if you want to consider some other cooler options. So that is definitely the case. So in other words, right now, you might be spending 50% more money if you go with that 4080 Super. And by the way, let me talk about this for a second. In my last video talking about the $800 versus $600 on the 4070 Super and 4070 Ti Super, I actually had numerous comments telling me I'm doing my percent increase wrong on these calculations. So let's talk about that for a second, because you can measure percent differences two ways, depending on which one you set as the baseline that you're considering to be 100%. And what's important isn't which way you do it, it's whether it's in line with your performance calculations. Both need to be done the same way. So if we look at this screenshot here, you can see that my 4080 Super is showing up as 118%. What does that mean? The 4070 Ti Super is setting as 100%. I'm using these numbers as my calculations, and so what I'm doing is I'm calling 40 FPS the 100% baseline, and I'm measuring the 47 FPS as the performance relative to that, which would be 118%, which is an 18% increase over the baseline value of 40. So that doesn't really matter so much as far as which way you do it, because I could have also set the 4080 Super as 100%, but then I could have set the 4070 Ti Super as a percentage of that. And either way works. What matters is when you do your price calculations and your performance calculations, you do it consistently. You might be like, does it really matter? It does. Because notice that 1200 compared to 800 is a 50% increase over 800 because it's a $400 difference, and $400 is 50%, half of 800. So you increase 800 by 50% of 800 to get to 1200. If you did it the other way around, 800 out of 1200, you now get 67%. In other words, 2/3. Because 800 is 2/3 of 1200. The $400 price difference, if you consider 1200 to be your 100% baseline, well, 400 is only 1/3 of 1200, or 33%-ish of 1200. So it's a 33% difference if you look at it this way, but it's a 50% difference if you look at it this way. And it doesn't actually matter which way you do this, as long as you do the performance and the price the same way. Sorry for my math rant, I'm actually a math teacher, so I got a little bit frustrated when people were calling me out on my math calculations there in the comment section. You can do it either way, but you wouldn't say it with the same words. You would say that the 4080 Super at $1,200 would be 50% more money than the 4070 Ti Super because you're comparing it to the 4070 Ti Super. If you were looking at it this way, you would say the 4070 Ti Super costs 67% of the price of the $1,200 4080 Super. See how you phrase that slightly differently. Anyway, I think I got way sidetracked there. Sorry for the math lesson. Let's run the benchmarks and I'll give you some final thoughts at the end. We'll kick off testing in Avatar Frontiers of Pandora, and at 1080p Ultra settings, both GPUs are doing great. 107 FPS versus 123. This is one of the best looking new titles out there. It does use ray tracing at all presets. There's no way to fully turn it off. And just a friendly reminder about the important note down at the bottom of the screen mentioning that when you capture at 60 frames per second, it can introduce motion judder and things like that to the recordings, so please judge smoothness by the frame time graphs and the 1% lows. Anyway, let's move on up to 1440p Ultra. I think more people would be targeting 1440p with these GPUs. And here we're seeing the Ti Super at 72 FPS and the 4080 Super at 87. So both pretty good, and it is a 21% lead for the 4080 Super, 16% lead in the 1% lows at 72 versus 62. And especially the Ti Super could maybe do for a bit of a higher frame rate in a first-person shooter style game. I know for me, even in single-player games, you know, that 80 to 100 FPS range feels a little nicer in the first-person shooter style. So if we kick on DLSS quality, that gets the job done. The 4070 up to 108 and the 4080 up to 128, giving it a 19% advantage, and the lows at 99 versus 86, a 15% advantage. But if you don't want to use upscaling at 1440p, although it does look pretty good, you can just turn down to high settings. NVIDIA hates this one simple trick of stretching out the life of your GPU. Don't turn on ultra settings. Anyway, we go to 114 FPS versus 99, so good high refresh rate experience with no upscaling at 15% advantage for the 4080 in both the averages and the 1% lows, which are 93 versus 81. But what if you're trying to buy these for a 4K resolution? I mean, we're talking $800 to $1,000 MSRP products. Well, 4K Ultra is going to be a bit much. It's certainly playable, but probably not the way you'd choose to play, if that makes sense. 47 FPS versus 40 gives the 4080 an 18% advantage in the averages and a 17% advantage in the 1% lows at 42 versus 36. So what if we kick on DLSS quality, which at 4K resolution, I mean, it's not always exactly just free performance from an image quality perspective, but it's pretty close. It looks quite good at 4K, you got a lot of pixels to work with. And now our frame rates jump up considerably to 77 and 65 respectively, giving the 4080 an 18% advantage in the averages and a 16% advantage in the 1% lows at 66 versus 57, both GPUs very playable there. Although, again, if you want to stay at native resolution, you could try reducing settings. However, at high settings, we're a little above or below 60 now, depending on which GPU you're using, at 63 versus 55, 15% advantage to the 4080. But I don't know if it's quite the high refresh rate experience you'd prefer in a first-person shooter. Of course, if you're sitting back with a controller on your couch, this is probably fine on a 4K TV. But with a mouse and a first-person shooter, kick on some DLSS quality, and if you're using high as your baseline of settings, we are now able to get a high refresh rate experience that I would say would be probably how I'd be playing it on these GPUs. We're at 100 FPS versus 86, which is a 16% advantage for the 4080. In the averages, a 17% advantage in the 1% lows at 83 versus 71. But let's jump into one of the other best looking new games pushing graphics. And while this game does have a crazy path tracing mode, we'll take a look at that in a minute. First, we'll start out at the high preset. There is no ultra preset in this game. This is the highest non-ray traced preset. And now we see the 4080 only winning by 10% at 81 versus 74 at 1440p. But you know, that's good, you know, frame rates for this game in any case. It's a pretty slow-paced game, and that's a pretty high refresh rate experience. However, if you're looking for even higher refresh rates, you could kick on DLSS quality. And interestingly, this game runs DLSS at all times, although you can run it in native DLAA resolution, which is kind of interesting. There's no TAA pathway, but that's a bit of a side note. Here we're seeing a 12% advantage for the 4080 at 118 versus 105. Both of them offering a nice high refresh rate experience here with DLSS quality enabled. But if you're already at high refresh rate experience, this is a game that offers frame generation. And if you kick on DLSS3 frame generation when you already have a high base frame rate, then the latency hit isn't too bad. You can see down at the bottom of the screen. And the overall image quality is still pretty good because there's not large gaps between frames when you're interpolating them. So you get a very high motion fluidity. Keep in mind that these frame rates would not be equivalent to achieving those frame rates without frame generation interpolating frames, if you were able to hit those natively. Speaking of native, how about 4K native resolution at the highest settings? Well, once again, sort of like we saw in Avatar, it's a bit much for these GPUs. It's playable, but again, probably not the way you'd want to play it. We're at 48 versus 42, which is a 14% advantage for the 4080 and a 19% advantage in the 1% lows at 37 versus 31. So I think it would definitely make sense to kick on DLSS quality. And if we do that, again, a large performance bump occurs. And the frame rates are now at 76 versus 68 respectively, which is a 12% advantage for the 4080 and a 17% advantage in the 1% lows at 56 versus 48. And so the game, you know, this slow pace of a game, I think that this is perfectly fine, but also you can kick on frame generation in this game, again, if you're at a high enough base frame rate. And for me, if you're over 60, it's probably fine. But everybody experiences it a little bit differently, so of course try it out for yourself. Kicking on frame generation gets the motion fluidity up to 102 frames per second and 89 frames per second respectively, a 15% advantage for the 4080, but again, keep in mind that the responsiveness and image quality is not quite as good as if you achieved those frame rates without frame generation. But what about the path tracing mode? I know you're probably not buying these GPUs for 1080p, but let's just throw it in here to see how they do. At 1080p RT high settings, that's kicking on all of the path tracing, everything maxed out. We're at native resolution, no DLSS, but it's only 1080p. The 4080 can hit 61 average here versus 54 on the 4070 Ti Super, which is a 13% advantage. So they're both able to hit around that 60 FPS mark at 1080p. What about at 1440p? Well, without DLSS, you're not going to have a good time. However, if you kick on DLSS quality, which is what we're measuring here, no frame generation yet, we're seeing right around that 60 FPS experience on both GPUs, one a bit above, one a bit below, giving the 4080 a 12% advantage at 65 versus 58 FPS averages, 48 versus 43 in the 1% lows. But again, when you're around that 60 FPS mark, frame generation can be a pretty good experience to smooth out the motion on a high refresh rate display. Again, not giving you the full responsiveness of the high refresh rate experience. But we're getting 107 versus 95 FPS of motion fluidity now, which is a 13% advantage to the 4080. And again, that's with the path tracing stuff maxed out, DLSS quality, pretty good experience there. But can these GPUs handle 4K path tracing? And I mean, if you go all the way down to DLSS performance mode, it's 50 FPS versus 44, 14% advantage to the 4080. DLSS performance mode does not look too bad at 4K resolution. So this is maybe an acceptable experience, but we're certainly not hitting 60 FPS. So I don't know, guys. You could try kicking on frame generation, but like I said, for me, I'd like to have a 60 FPS baseline before I kick it on. If you look at the average PC latency down at the bottom of the screen, those numbers are a bit higher than I'm personally comfortable with when using a mouse. If using a controller, it doesn't bother me as much. I guess I either just naturally expect more latency or there's less of a one-to-one responsiveness. But anyway, you can try frame generation here to smooth things out on a higher refresh rate display. Let's move on to another path tracing test with Cyberpunk at 1080p RT Overdrive mode. Neither GPU hit 60 FPS in the built-in benchmark run. I'm seeing 54 versus 49. Certainly playable. It's a 10% advantage to the 4080, 17% lead in the 1% lows at 42 versus 36. But, you know, it's definitely not a high refresh rate experience. But I think people are going to be more interested in the 1440p results, so rather than kicking on DLSS at 1080p, let's just move on to 1440p. And with no DLSS, we're at 35 versus 29 FPS averages, which is not great. So 21% lead for the 4080 here in the averages and the 1% lows. But it's kind of a Pyrrhic victory, or, you know, it's just not the way you'd want to play the game. So if you kick on DLSS quality, which at 1440p can still look quite good, we're now getting a much more acceptable experience at 66 versus 59 FPS, 12% lead for the 4080. And I think both GPUs are perfectly playable now with path tracing, and DLSS quality is not too much of an image quality compromise here, especially with ray reconstruction helping some of the temporal stability. Although in this game it can have a little bit of a weird look on faces I've seen. But anyway, when we are able to achieve that kind of 60 FPS-ish baseline, I think kicking on frame generation can make sense. You can see the PC latency does go up compared to our last test without frame generation, but the motion fluidity would be a lot higher. At 109 versus 97 FPS here, we're getting a 12% lead for the 4080 and a 14% lead in the averages. And I'm feeling a lot of people, this would be the settings you'd use on a 1440p display on either of these GPUs to play this game. If we move up to 4K resolution, again, kind of like we saw in Alan Wake 2, DLSS performance mode with path tracing enabled gets us playable, but not over 60 FPS. 53 versus 47, 13% advantage to the 4080 in the averages, 15% advantage in the 1% lows. Again, the performance mode upscaling can be acceptable here. We're just not getting to a real high refresh rate experience. You can try kicking on frame generation here. The average PC latency in Cyberpunk doesn't seem as high as it is in Alan Wake 2. Every game can be a little bit different there. So this, I don't know, this might work out for some people and not others. There's also image quality concerns the lower your base frame rate is, because the interpolation's more difficult. We're seeing 73 versus 60 of motion fluidity now, but not responsiveness. 22% lead in the averages there. But let's jump into some Unreal Engine 5 testing. Lords of the Fallen is the most demanding Unreal Engine 5 game that I've been testing out. And so I'll even look at it at 1080p, where at ultra settings, we're seeing 95 versus 84, so good results. But again, that's only 1080p. 1% lows are 71 versus 60, so 18% advantage there and 13% advantage in the averages for the 4080. What about 1440p resolution? You can see how demanding this is. 1440p Ultra sees the 4070 Ti Super only hitting 62 FPS average, which sure, it's playable, but it's hardly a high refresh rate experience on an $800 GPU, but 71 FPS on the 4080 Super, giving it a 15% lead in the averages and a 22% lead in the 1% lows at 55 versus 45. But Unreal Engine 5 really does seem to be designed with upscaling in mind. Its performance scales massively with resolution. So if you lower the internal resolution using DLSS quality, we now see frame rates jump all the way up to 93 and 103 respectively, giving the 4080 an 11% advantage in the averages, but an overall high refresh rate experience now. That 1% lows are 73 versus 65, which is a 12% lead for the 4080. What if we move up to 4K and, like we've seen, this engine, the resolution has a huge demand on performance, and both of these GPUs often are falling short of 60 FPS at 4K native resolution at ultra settings, even without, ray tracing and all that. We're seeing 41 versus 35, which is 17% lead for the 4080, 14% lead in the 1% lows, but again, probably not the way you're going to play the game. So if we kick on DLSS quality, again, Unreal Engine 5 seems to scale massively with rendering resolution, and performance jumps all the way to 61 and 71 respectively. That is a huge performance jump for kicking on DLSS quality here. So now at 71 versus 61 FPS, we're getting a 16% lead for the 4080 and a 17% lead in the 1% lows at 55 versus 47. I think we got a pretty good experience here. There's no frame generation available in Lords of the Fallen currently. But let's move on to RoboCop Rogue City, which is another Unreal Engine 5 game and is less demanding at its max settings. Here the max settings are called epic settings, and 1080p, you know, we're kind of almost hitting CPU limits. At 1440p, we're still getting a pretty good experience here at 86 versus 79, 9% advantage for the 4080. So not a massive lead here for the 4080, but pretty good experience on both GPUs. Let's just jump all the way up to 4K resolution, where again, you can see that the demand by moving up to 4K is considerable. And at epic settings, both GPUs are once again falling below 60 FPS. Here we're at 50 versus 43. Playable, but probably not how you'd want to play a first-person shooter. 16% advantage for the 4080 in the averages, and a 19% advantage in the 1% lows at 44 versus 37. But this being Unreal Engine 5, if you kick on DLSS quality, it again scales performance massively. And we're seeing 77 versus 68 now for our average frame rates, giving a 13% advantage to the 4080 Super. And if we look at the 1% lows, we're seeing 65 versus 57, giving a 14% advantage to the 4080 Super. And since we're over 60 FPS, this game does offer frame generation, and I thought I'd kick it on. And so our motion fluidity now increases to 105 frames per second and 93 at frames per second, 13% lead to the 4080. But again, keep in mind that the motion fluidity offered by frame generation is not the same thing as the increased responsiveness you would get from achieving this frame rate naturally. But the PC latency here does feel pretty good to me at these settings and frame rates. Let's go ahead and move on to Starfield. At 1440p ultra settings, we are getting 88 versus 79 FPS. That is an 11% advantage to the 4080 Super, and a 9% lead in the 1% lows at 63 versus 58. I'm using this section of New Atlantis for the test, which is more demanding than a lot of the kind of, you know, combat areas and things of the game, but less demanding than a few others though, so I think it's a pretty fair test. If we move up to 4K resolution though, at ultra settings, we're now seeing the 4080 able to hit 60 FPS, the 4070 Ti Super falling a bit short at 53. On a variable refresh rate display, it probably wouldn't feel massively different though. That's a 13% advantage for the 4080, and the 1% lows are a 10% advantage for the 4080 at 45 versus 41. But again, in a first-person shooter style game, those probably weren't the frame rates we were looking for, so what about DLSS quality, which looks quite good at 4K? And now we're jumping to 80 FPS versus 72 respectively, giving an 11% lead to the 4080. The 1% lows are at 59 and 50, giving an 18% advantage to the 4080 Super, and we overall have a pretty good experience here. However, this game does offer frame generation. So if you want to take advantage of the motion fluidity of a high refresh rate display, we had a high enough base frame rate that frame generation could make sense, increasing the motion fluidity to 111 and 99 frames per second respectively, 12% advantage to the 4080. 1% lows are now 92 versus 84, which is a big jump, and I think the 1% lows here can be very CPU bound, and frame generation can push through that. Just keep in mind that, again, it's not quite equivalent to achieving those frame rates without frame generation. What about Baldur's Gate 3? Well, at 1440p, we are CPU limited, which is why the GPUs are within margin of error of each other at 1% advantage in the 1% lows to the 4080, 3% advantage in the averages to the Ti Super. But again, that's just variance, you know, in CPU limited situations. A 1 to 3% variance is pretty common, so basically that's a tie in a CPU limited situation. Nothing to see here. Move on to 4K Ultra though, and we are now more GPU bound, and we're seeing the 4080 Super able to pull ahead by 16% at 94 FPS versus 81. Both of these GPUs are putting up very good frame rates for this style of game. So basically, yes, you can max this game out natively at 4K on both GPUs, no trouble. Let's go ahead and move on to a different game engine as well. This is the RE engine from Capcom with Resident Evil 4 Remake. And 1440p max settings do include some ray-traced reflections, although they're not super high resolution. And this game does like to use a lot of VRAM and all that, but frame rates are good here. We're at 157 versus 136, 15% advantage to the 4080 Super, 11% lead in the 1% lows. Let's crank things up to 4K. So at 4K max settings, we're still, even without any upscaling, able to hit good frame rates. 96 versus 81, it's a 19% advantage to the 4080 Super. And the 1% lows are 87 versus 73, again a 19% advantage to the 4080 Super. You see that this engine game certainly seems very performant at 4K even compared to a lot of the other games we've tested here so far. Now, let's go ahead and test out one more game with Call of Duty Modern Warfare 3. And I'll be testing the basic preset, assuming that you'd be turning down visual settings to increase frame rates for competitive purposes. And that pushes our frame rates at 1080p all the way up to 352 versus 328, which is only a 7% advantage to the 4080. But again, the lower your resolution is, the more likely you are to be slowed down by other things in the system or game engine, things like that, not fully GPU bound. Anyway, if we move up to 1440p basic settings, we're now seeing a 10% advantage for the 4080 Super, although a 20% advantage in the 1% lows. The averages are 282 versus 256 respectively, so certainly high enough that if you didn't get the kill, it's a skill issue, not the hardware, guys. And the 1% lows are 201 versus 168. So again, a little bit more meaningful lead there in the 1% lows. And if we go up to 4K basic settings, we're now seeing a 15% advantage for the 4080 and 21% lead in the 1% lows. So again, it's growing as the resolution increases. The average frame rates at 180 versus 157 are still quite high, although you could definitely turn on something like upscaling here, DLSS quality, to boost frame rates even more and still look quite good. Even DLSS performance mode in a competitive game. Let's pop out for some final thoughts. All right, so final thoughts. If we go ahead and just look at this relative performance number on the 4080 Super, and I just kind of quickly scroll through the results, what you'll notice is that generally we're getting numbers between 10 and 20%. 20% is pretty rare. We're usually somewhere in between. 15% seems to be, a pretty reasonable number to call somewhere in the middle, both in frequency and results. So basically, I think calling it roughly a 15-ish% performance increase for the 4080 Super is pretty reasonable. So then you could do some value calculations, but I also think that value calculations only gets you part of the picture when you're considering two different GPUs. For example, when I was comparing the 12GB GPU versus the 16GB GPU, you have to think about, okay, there's longevity versus now and things like that. But remember, the 4080 Super and the 4070 Ti Super, from a feature set standpoint and from a VRAM standpoint and everything like that else, there's really not much in it. It's just a performance and price difference. So with that in mind, is this level of performance getting you a meaningfully different experience? So, in the hardest situations we have right now, we're talking like path tracing modes and things like that. Does it get you a meaningfully different experience? Well, you're getting just under 60 FPS on your 4070 Ti Super. You're getting a little over 60 FPS on the 4080 Super, but it's not like, going from a 60 to like a high refresh rate experience. I would call these basically the same experience from like if you turned the frame rate counters off and you were just playing the game, would you notice a huge difference jumping from one PC to the other if you had an A/B blind test here? And you might be able to tell the 4080 Super was running a little bit faster. But guys, when it's like a 12% performance gap, that type of thing, like I don't think we're getting a meaningfully different thing here. Now, what about at 4K resolution where you really need every frame you can get? Well, the problem here is for the most demanding 4K titles, like I said, path tracing modes, even with performance level upscaling, neither GPU is delivering 60 FPS. And so if we get even more demanding path tracing games coming out over the next few years, I'm not sure these are 4K path tracing GPUs. So in other words, let me put it like this. I don't think the 4080 Super can really do anything meaningfully different than the 4070 Ti Super. So if you look at it from that perspective, I don't think that when it's got the inflated price tag of $1,200, it makes any sense at all. You're paying, like I said, if it's at the $1,200 price point, 50% more money to get 10 to 15% more performance, occasionally maybe 20%, but that's pretty rare. Now, if it's available at its actual MSRP of $1,000, you're paying 25% more money to get maybe 15-ish more performance. So it's certainly worse value, but the scaling isn't awful. Keep in mind that in general, throughout the history of the GPU market, there's usually diminishing returns for a performance per dollar standpoint as you go up the more expensive GPUs in the product stack. So, in other words, at its MSRP of $1,000, it's not a ridiculous thing to do to spend the additional money. But it is definitely better value to get the 4070 Ti Super. And then I just want to remind you that the 4070 Super non-Ti at $600, if you're just looking at a performance per dollar calculation, offered better value than the 4070 Ti Super. So you got the 4080 Super offering worse value than the 4070 Ti Super, which offers worse value than the 4070 Super. So if you're hunting value, stop at the $600 price point. Or you can also consider some AMD alternatives depending on where your priorities lie on, ray tracing and upscaling and all of that. But explore my head-to-head comparisons with AMD GPUs if you want to go that route. If you want to move up to 4K path tracing situations, I think only the 4090 is going to offer you that. And yeah, it's really expensive right now. And maybe then just wait for what the high-end GPUs in like the 50 series have to offer a year from now, that kind of thing. But yeah, so my overall thought is if they're both at their MSRP, the 4070 Ti Super is still better value, but it's not ridiculously so. But if you're thinking about spending $1,200 on a 4080 Super, I really think the 4070 Ti Super probably just makes a lot more sense. Anyway, I hope that you guys found this video useful and or interesting, and I hope, actually huge thank you to viewers, commenters, even if you're criticizing my math, we can have a math conversation. Subscribers, and especially channel members who have directly funded the channel on a monthly basis by clicking the join button. That is absolutely huge. Thank you. It helps to get the motivation to put together these massive head-to-head comparisons, which do take quite a bit of time to put together, running the benchmarks and editing and all that. So huge thank you, but I totally understand that not everybody's in a financial position to do that, so that is totally fine, and I hope all of you have an excellent day.